In this video, we'll be looking at the rise of dictators. In the 2 decades after World War I, many countries would experience the worst depression in their history, including the United States' own Great Depression that occurred during the 1930s. After the events that occurred in Russia, many countries now look to a strong anti-communist leader to calm fears of an international communist revolution. And they would find those strong leaders under a new political philosophy known as fascism. Now, this political philosophy glorifies the state over the individual by emphasizing the need for a strong central government led by an authoritative or authoritarian ruler. This is a direct opposition from a democracy in which it's believed that the people can govern themselves and that the government's job is to help facilitate that. With fascism, it's believed that the people are not able to govern themselves, hence why a strong authoritative leader is needed. And because the people are not able to govern themselves, the people need only serve and glorify the state in order for it to expand and gain resources to become self-sufficient and protect the people. In protecting the people, many times the government will limit their freedoms in order to better secure the nation and protect the people. In doing so, the government often has complete control over media, resources, and services. In this way, a fascist government is able to control what the people have access to, whether that be resources or information. And controlling information or media is a very powerful tool because it can help a nation manipulate or brainwash the public into believing whatever the state wants them to believe. Because again, the government controls the media and what the public is allowed to know. As far as resources go, many nations are not able to be self-sufficient with the resources within their own country. A fascist government sees the solution to this problem by becoming very militant and conquering territory to gain those resources it needs. And looking at this poster, you can see some of the early warning signs of fascism: powerful and continuing nationalism, a disdain for human rights, the identification of enemies or scapegoats as a very unifying cause, the supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, again, as we said earlier, controlling mass media, the obsession with national security, religion and government becoming very intertwined with each other, corporate power is protected while labor power is suppressed, a disdain for intellectuals or anybody that might challenge them, disdain for the arts, obsession with crime and punishment, rampant cronyism and corruption, and fraudulent elections. So these are all early warning signs that you can point to say this is leading towards fascism. So let's begin by talking about some of these authoritarian rulers that rise to power in the 1920s and 30s following the Great War. Now first, in 1922, you have Benito Mussolini. He came to power in Italy by threatening to march on Rome unless he was given the position of prime minister by the politically weak king. And so eventually he becomes the dictator of Italy, turning it into a fascist government. He himself is the founder of fascism. And with the help of his paramilitary group, known as the Black Shirts, and paramilitary meaning private military group, with their help he is able to march on Rome and uses this army to attack communists and socialists and any other opponents that he has that oppose fascism. He also goes as far as to outlaw all other political parties, making fascist party the only party allowed in Italy. He established a secret police and controlled all forms of media, including newspapers, radio, and film. So again, he has complete control over Italy. But Italy is not alone in having these strong dictators rise to power. In 1926, Emperor Hirohito is the emperor of Japan that wants to modernize his country, bring Japan into the 20th century as an industrial power like other Western countries. And in doing so, at one point, Premier Tojo is appointed as the Prime Minister of Japan, and as a general of Japan's armed forces, Tojo creates a fascist military government in Japan, with the Japanese military pretty much dictating the course of the nation through territorial conquest. But like Italy and Japan, Spain also transformed into a fascist state after a bloody civil war left the country in the hands of Francisco Franco. But unlike those nations that were content to control their governments in every way, the leaders of Germany and the Soviet Union insisted on total control over every aspect of the people's lives. And so we see the rise of totalitarian regimes in both these countries, emphasizing the idea there of total control. And we can see this following the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924 with the rise of Joseph Stalin in 1926. When Stalin takes over, he is in control over a very weak, crippled country that is quickly falling behind the rest of the powerful nations of the world. You can see the quote from Stalin in 1931 in which he says, quote, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do, or they will crush us." What he means by that is that compared to the other advanced nations in the world, like Britain, Germany, France, and the United States, the Soviet Union is where they were 50 to 100 years ago. Basically, the Soviet Union is behind, especially in the area of industry, and with a lot of catching up to do. Stalin believes, and maybe rightfully so, that if Russia doesn't close the gap between itself and those other advanced nations within 5 to 10 years, then Russia is going to be left behind and no longer going to be able to compete with the big boys. And so Stalin transforms the Soviet Union from a very poor nation to an industrial powerhouse. When you look at industrial output in Russia, goes up 250%, oil output goes up 300%, and steel output goes up 400%. The Soviet Union becoming the second largest producer of steel in Europe. But while Stalin is increasing the industrial output of his country, he's not increasing the agricultural output of his country. And so during Stalin's early reign, many people starved to death. And if they don't starve to death, he is eliminating them through very brutal tactics of sending them to concentration camps, which are called gulags in Russia, in which nearly 17 million people die, many of them simply political opponents that he has eliminated. But the reason that Stalin is able to increase their output so quickly is that he makes it a major goal of the Soviet Union in what he calls his 5-year plans. Every 5 years we have to achieve these goals to attain prosperity. But moving on to a decade after the Great War ends, in 1928, the major nations of the world come together and sign something known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is an international outlaw of war as a means to settle problems. Which sounds great. It sounds very idealistic. We're no longer going to engage in war to settle our problems. But the problem there is, how do you enforce that? What do you do if a country decides to go to war? How do you stop them? It's kind of hard to stop a nation from going to war without, in some ways, engaging in war to stop them. Case in point, in 1931, Italy invades Ethiopia, down here in Africa, which is off the current map that you see there, but it's in this box area I'll zoom into. Mussolini triumphs in Ethiopia, and he invades it for resources. Again, we had talked earlier about these countries needing resources. But Italy is not alone. In 1932, Japan invades Manchuria for the same reason, natural resources. And eventually we'll even go on to invade China. In both instances, nothing really is done about it, other than maybe a slap on the wrist and you shouldn't have done that. Meanwhile, in Germany, extreme nationalism fed the desire to conquer other nations and unite all German people. The alleged stab in the back in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles by the nation's leaders also fueled the nation's frustrations, while economic problems focused attention on Jews, who stereotypically control money. All of this combined to fuel a new political party struggling to gain a foothold in German politics, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis. Now, when we think of Nazism, What it is a totalitarian political system. Again, a government with total power over everything. So this political system, not only do they want to control everything, they have this belief in the racial purity and superiority of the Aryan race, essentially Western and Northern European people. Now, it's hard to talk about Nazism without mentioning Adolf Hitler. He became the Nazi leader after World War I with the help of brown-shirted paramilitary group known as the Stormtroopers, who terrorized their political opponents. Essentially, the Nazi Party had their own private army, as many political parties in Germany at that time did. Now, the first time that many Germans hear about Nazism and Hitler is after he is arrested for a failed attempt to overthrow the German province of Bavaria in what's known as the Beer Hall Putsch, Putsch meaning revolt. Now, Hitler is tried and goes to jail for less than a year, but it's during his trial where Hitler gains national attention, spotlighting his frustrations with the current government that many people came to appreciate and admire. The way he spoke, what he was talking about, how the current German government was a laughingstock, that they had signed Germany's death warrant by signing the Treaty of Versailles, that Germans should be allowed to hold their head up high and that this is not the way things should be. A lot of people agreed with Hitler. Many Germans felt that they had been wronged after World War I with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And so Hitler is simply vocalizing what many Germans felt during this time. But while Hitler was in jail, he spent some time writing his autobiography called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. In this autobiography, Hitler details his beliefs and his future plans. One of which is that he believed that Germany needed living space, that Germany was too small to contain the German people, and to gain this living space, Germany should expand to the east. And that's a nice way of putting it, but to expand means basically conquer the east, Eastern Europe. He also believed that Germany should remove the Jews and enslave the Slavs, the Slavic people being those that live in Eastern Europe. So as we conquer them, let's enslave them. The Jews, we should eliminate them. He also believed that Germany, like Italy, needed an authoritative leader, what he called the Führer. So what Hitler is describing here is very strong anti-Semitic views, believing that the Jews were responsible for many of Germany's political and economic problems, and how Germany needed a very strong, authoritative leader with essentially unlimited power to fix Germany's problems. Now, throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, a Great Depression hits Germany where unemployment reaches 43% by the end of 1932. That's nearly half of every German person was unemployed and out of work. In the United States, the unemployment rate didn't jump higher than 25%. In Germany, it's 43%. This economic crisis played into Hitler's hands as he began promising German voters economic and political salvation, that he would not only save Germany, but he would also rearm the German armed forces and build a strong military once again. And in 1932, the Nazis get their chance. In the Reichstag election, the Reichstag being the name for the German parliament, in this election, the Nazis become the second largest party in Germany, the first being the Social Democrats and the third being the Communists. Again, they're not the largest party, they're the second largest party. But it was understood that the Social Democrats were the old party and were starting to fall out of favor with many Germans and would be replaced by whoever was in second. Now, who was in second wasn't cut and dry. As of the Reichstag election in 1932, it's the Nazis that are in second place, but the Communists were right there on their heels, and it could really go either way in the next few years. But because the Nazis had gained such a huge margin in the German parliament, the Nazis began to demand that they play a larger role in government. They believed that Hitler, the leader of their party, should have a much higher role in the German government. And so the president at that time, President Hindenburg, is almost kind of forced by the Nazis to make Hitler chancellor. Chancellor being second in command, in charge of the legislature, in charge of the Reichstag. He's kind of the vice president, if you want to look at it that way. And so soon after that, we start to see the emergence of what's known as the Third Reich. Reich being the German word for empire. So the Third German Empire that lasts from 1933 to 1945. The first empire being the Holy Roman Empire, the second one being the one that we saw fall at the end of World War I. This is the third one. And you might say it starts to begin in February of 1933 with the Reichstag fire. What happens here is a fire occurs at the German parliament, but it's blamed on the communists. And the idea there is that maybe these communists were possibly attempting a revolution like what had happened in Russia, a political revolution that will overthrow the current government and put in place a communist government. Now, many people believe, and maybe rightfully so, that the Nazis themselves may have started this fire, but used it as an excuse to blame the communists, their biggest political rival at this point, and be allowed to step up persecution of the Communist Party, kind of paint them in a very bad light, that they were responsible, that they're bad people, and the Nazis are good. They will save Germany from the communists, and these kind of radical moves that the communists are plotting, even though the communists may not even be doing any of this. Again, many believe the Nazis are kind of using this as propaganda. But in response to this fire, there is a growing attitude and feeling that the German government in its current state could not handle or anticipate quickly enough all the problems facing Germany at that time. That if a revolution was coming, like what had happened in Russia during the Russian Revolution, that the German government could not handle it. So to deal with this growing fear, in 1933, the Reichstag votes to give Hitler dictatorial power over the legislature during these desperate times. And this is known as the Enabling Act. What it essentially does is override the German Constitution. Under the German Constitution, any new laws or policies would have to go through the legislative process from those in the Reichstag to be debated and voted on before it gets passed. The belief there is this process takes too long, but by giving Hitler the sole power to make laws and changes, he can very quickly react to the problems facing Germany by being allowed to do what he wants to for the most part in order to combat these problems in these desperate times. Again, desperate times calls for desperate measures. Now, Hitler isn't in complete control at this point. President Hindenburg still remains in control of the army and foreign policy, but Hitler now has control of the legislature and is able to make laws as he sees fit. And in the summer of the following year, in 1934, you have an event known as the Night of the Long Knives, in which Hitler supposedly stops an attempted coup, or overthrow of government, by the Nazi paramilitary group. There were still people within the Nazi party that could still oppose Hitler. Yes, he was the leader of the party, but he still had opposition within his own party to some of his policies, and these people threatened his political status in the government and his rise to power. Plus, the Nazis had their own private military, that paramilitary group that worried a lot of people outside of the Nazi party, including the German army, who feared this group threatening their role in Germany, maybe even being taken over by the Nazi military and losing power. So Hitler's solution to his party's military arm and to those in his party that did and could still oppose him was to eliminate them in what is referred to as a purge. Basically, Hitler had his political opposition and military leaders of the Nazi army killed, but used the excuse that they were trying to overthrow the government in a coup, and he stepped in and stopped it. This helped show Hitler as kind of a savior of Germany, while also gaining some support from big business in the army, who again had been suspicious of Hitler's private Nazi paramilitary group. But in the end, Hitler will maintain a very small military group within the Nazi Party known as the Gestapo, which will carry out a lot of his secretive policies. Now, in August of 1934, President Hindenburg dies, leaving Hitler the new president of Germany. Now, Hitler goes on to abolish the presidency and the chancellery, combining the power into a new supreme leader known as the Führer, which would have supreme power. Now, you might think that many people in Germany would be opposed to Hitler taking on so much power, but actually 90% of Germany approved this. Hitler was now in complete control, not just of Germany's government, but now he has complete control over the military and foreign policy as well. He has supreme, total power. So the last thing that we're going to look at is the treatment of Jews when it comes to the Nazis. In 1935, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws, which took citizenship or rights away from Jews. They essentially had no rights as citizens. They couldn't appeal to the government for any grievances. They were forced to identify themselves as Jews, being forced to wear the Star of David that said Judah or Jew on it. So you can start to see that the Jews are starting to be persecuted as early as 1935, legally in Germany. 3 years later, in 1938, the event known as Kristallnacht, which means the Night of Broken Glass, happens. Here, Hitler ordered an attack on Jewish communities where well-organized waves of violence destroyed homes, synagogues, businesses. All were attacked and destroyed. And so you can see the escalation of the attitude towards Jews from just simple discrimination to now physical damage is being done. But Hitler's last solution, as he called it, would become known as the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust took 6 million Jews and killed them in concentration camps or death camps, the most famous being Auschwitz. You had different types of camps, like work camps, where people were sent to work or be worked to death. And then there were literal death camps, where the people that were sent there to die, to be killed. And 6 million Jews were killed in these camps. Now, what is sometimes forgotten is that those 6 million Jews only make up half of those who died in the Holocaust. They just make up the largest percentage of those killed in these camps. There were 6 million other people that died in the Holocaust that were made up of Slavs, Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, homosexuals, mentally handicapped, or just political enemies and opponents. So when you look at the Holocaust, it's not just 6 million Jews that die in these camps, but 12 million people that are killed in the Holocaust. And you can see some of the horrible living conditions in these camps through images online. I've selected a few famous ones here where you can see the sleeping conditions in these camps and just what condition that these prisoners were held in, where they're little more than skin and bones. They've been so underfed. Here's a picture taken by the United States as they are pushing through and liberating these camps during World War II of just the conditions that they find these prisoners in. They're just horrible. But in the end, as a result of Hitler's rise to power, he is able to rebuild Germany. Unemployment in Germany dropped from 6 million in 1933 to 1 million in 1936. By 1938, women had to join the workforce just to be able to fill all the positions needed to fuel Germany's growing war machine. Hitler took Germany from poverty to the strongest industrial and military power in Europe, and he did it all in 6 years. And he will take that military and industrial power to fuel his war machine that will lead to World War II.